My husband said he was flying to the Maldives with the woman he truly loves, leaving me stranded in a snowy cabin with barely 2 weeks of supplies and no phone, insisting I'd manage on my own. As his car disappeared down the road, I simply smiled. He had no clue what awaited him at the airport. You'll survive. You always do. That's your problem. Actually, you're a survivor. Forrest said it like an insult. Like my ability to endure made me disposable. Like resilience was weakness instead of strength. I was lying in my grandmother's cabin, 2 days after emergency surgery, watching through a frost-clouded window as my husband threw his suitcase into my Jeep. His mistress, 26, toned, glowing with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences, was already in the passenger seat. They were going to the Maldives. 7 days. Overwater bungalow. $42,000 of our joint savings funding their romantic escape. Meanwhile, I was stranded here. No phone, no transportation, no way to call for help if complications set in. The surgeon had been explicit. I was vulnerable. I needed constant monitoring. Infection, hemorrhaging, a dozen things could go wrong. Forrest knew that. He'd been there when the doctor explained it, phone in hand, barely listening. He'd smiled then. The same smile he was wearing now as he climbed into the driver's seat. He rolled down the window, leaned out. Oh, and Brooke? I changed the locks on the apartment this morning. Just so you know. Wouldn't want you wasting energy trying to get in when you finally make it back to civilization. He laughed. Actually laughed. I stood at the window, one hand pressed against the surgical incision, the other braced against the wall for support. Every breath was agony. Every heartbeat a reminder that I should be in a hospital, not abandoned in the mountains. But I wasn't crying. Wasn't collapsing. Wasn't breaking the way Forrest expected. I was smiling. Because he'd made a catastrophic mistake. He thought he'd planned everything. Thought he'd accounted for every variable. Thought I'd be too weak, too isolated, too broken to fight back. He'd forgotten one thing. He'd forgotten who I was. And that oversight was going to cost him everything. The Jeep's taillights disappeared around the bend where the pine trees grew thick enough to block the sky. I watched until there was nothing left but tire tracks in the snow and the faint smell of exhaust hanging in the cold mountain air. My legs were shaking. The walk from the bed to the window, maybe 15 feet, had taken everything I had. The incision pulled with each breath, a reminder that my body had been opened, gutted, fundamentally altered just 48 hours ago. Emergency hysterectomy. That's what the surgeon had called it when I'd woken up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, Forrest nowhere to be seen. I'd been hemorrhaging at home. Massive blood loss. The kind where minutes matter. Forrest had driven me to the ER with his jaw clenched tight, hands gripping the steering wheel like he was angry at me, at the inconvenience of my medical emergency interrupting whatever he'd been doing that afternoon. The surgeon had been a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much. She'd explained everything while Forrest stood in the corner of my hospital room, scrolling his phone with the focus of someone reading something far more important than his wife's medical crisis. I'd watched her eyes flick from him to me, watched her mouth tighten almost imperceptibly. Recognition. The universal signal women give each other when they see what's really happening beneath the surface. Complete bed rest for 2 weeks minimum, she'd said, directing her words at me but watching Forrest. No stairs. No lifting anything heavier than a water bottle. You'll need constant monitoring for fever, excessive bleeding, signs of infection. You'll be extremely vulnerable during recovery. That word. Vulnerable. Forrest had looked up from his phone then. And smiled. I should have known right then what he was planning. Should have recognized that smile for what it was. Not relief that I'd survived, but calculation. Opportunity. But I'd been too drugged, too exhausted, too focused on the searing pain across my abdomen to think clearly. Now standing at the cabin window watching the space where my Jeep had been, I understood everything. This morning Forrest had brought me breakfast, lukewarm oatmeal that tasted like paste and my pain medication. I'd watched him move around the room with that careful efficiency, like he was checking items off a mental list. Then he'd done something that made my stomach drop. He'd picked up my phone from the nightstand and slipped it into his pocket. The movement was so smooth, so practiced I'd almost missed it. You need complete rest, he'd said, smiling that smile. Doctor's orders. No work stress, no social media rabbit holes. I'm doing you a favor, Brooke. I'd wanted to argue, but the pain had been too sharp, the medication making my thoughts slow and sticky. I'd watched him leave the room, heard him moving through the cabin, heard the scrape of firewood being stacked, the clank of cans being organized in the pantry. He'd been preparing, planning, making sure I had just enough to survive but not enough to escape. Then he'd come back to the bedroom and delivered his announcement like he was reporting a business trip. I'm flying to the Maldives. With Natalie. You remember Natalie? My personal trainer. Natalie. Of course it was Natalie. I'd met her twice. Once when I'd picked Forrest up from the gym 6 months ago, she'd barely glanced at me, just kept talking to Forrest about core engagement and optimizing his routine. The second time was at a fundraiser 3 months back. She'd looked through me like I was furniture. 26 years old. All toned muscle and high ponytails and Instagram posts about wellness journeys and living your best life. And now she was in my Jeep heading to the Maldives with my husband, funded by my money. I'm taking the joint savings, Forrest had said, words tumbling out faster like he wanted to get it all out before I could interrupt. All 42,000. Already transferred it this morning while you were sleeping. Turns out Natalie and I don't need a down payment on a bigger house. We need a vacation. We need to remember what it feels like to be young and happy. He'd pulled our apartment keys from his jacket pocket, the keys on the Tiffany keyring I'd given him on our wedding day, and dropped them on the floor. The sound they'd made was small but final. Like bones breaking. Change the locks too. Your stuff's in storage. Public storage on Route 38, Unit 519. Paid for 1 month. After that, they auction it off. So you might want to prioritize picking it up when you get back to civilization. I tried to stand. Made it halfway before the pain folded me back onto the bed. I'd pressed both hands against the incision, feeling heat, inflammation or rage, impossible to distinguish. Why? I'd whispered. Forrest had actually considered the question, tilting his head like I was a mildly interesting puzzle. Because I want more. Because you're 39 and you let yourself go. Because Natalie makes me feel alive in a way you haven't in years. He'd straightened, adjusting his leather jacket, the one I'd bought him for our 8th anniversary. Because the opportunity presented itself. Your surgery, this isolated cabin, perfect timing, and I'm smart enough to take it. That's when he'd said it. That line about me being a survivor. Like it was my fatal flaw instead of my strength. Now I stood at the window watching the empty space where my life used to be, and let myself remember what Forrest had conveniently forgotten. This cabin wasn't a prison. It was my grandmother's legacy. Gram had left it to me 3 years ago when she passed. It had been her refuge after my grandfather died. A place where she'd rebuilt herself, learned who she was without a man defining her, created a life on her own terms. She taught me everything during the summers I'd spent here as a kid. How to split wood. How to read weather patterns in the clouds. How to start a fire with damp kindling. How to be alone without being lonely. You're stronger than you know, Brooke, she told me during my last visit before she died. We'd been sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Life's going to test that strength someday. When it does, remember where you come from. Remember what I taught you. At the time, I thought she was just being sentimental. Gram was 83, reflecting on her life, passing down wisdom the way grandmothers do. But now I understood. She'd been preparing me, warning me. She'd met Forrest exactly once, at our wedding. I'd watched her watch him throughout the ceremony, her expression unreadable. During the reception, she'd pulled me aside. Trust your instincts, Brooke, she'd whispered, gripping my hands with surprising strength. Always. I'd laughed it off, too happy and in love to hear what she was really saying. But Gram had known. Somehow she'd seen what I couldn't, that the man I was marrying had the capacity for this kind of cruelty. I forced myself to move away from the window, each step a negotiation with pain. The bedroom was small, sparse, exactly as Gram had left it. Handmade quilt on the bed. Simple dresser. A wooden chair by the window where she used to sit and read. And on the wall, barely visible in the weak morning light, a framed cross-stitch she'd made years ago. A woman who knows her worth doesn't measure herself by a man's opinion. I stared at it, feeling something shift in my chest. Not just pain. Something harder. More solid. Forrest thought he'd destroyed me. Thought he'd left me broken and helpless and alone. He was wrong. I made my way to the kitchen, every step deliberate, every breath measured. It took 5 minutes to cross the main room. 5 minutes of agony and determination. But I made it. And there, mounted on the wall next to the ancient refrigerator, exactly where my brother Garrett had installed it 3 years ago, was the satellite phone. I lifted the receiver. Heard the dial tone, clear and beautiful as a promise. Forrest had made his calculations, planned his escape, accounted for every variable. Except one. He'd underestimated me. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. I dialed from memory, fingers steady despite everything. 4 rings. Then Garrett's voice, sharp with alarm. Brooke? Jesus Christ, where are you? I've been calling for 2 days. Your phone goes straight to voicemail. Garrett. My voice came out calmer than I felt. Controlled. Nothing like the victim Forrest had tried to leave behind. I need you to do something for me. Right now. Are you near your computer? Silence. Then carefully, what happened? I'll explain later. Right now I need you to make a call. Airport security. International terminal. There's a flight to the Maldives leaving tonight. Wait, what? The Maldives? Brooke, what the hell is going on? I need you to report 2 passengers traveling with stolen funds. Credit card fraud. Unauthorized use of a joint account by one party without the other's consent. The silence stretched longer this time. I could hear my brother breathing, could almost see him processing, calculating. Garrett wasn't just a software engineer. He was my software engineer. The person who taught me that preparation beats panic, that trust without verification is just controlled demolition in slow motion. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Gotten harder. More focused. Tell me everything. So I did. I told him about Forrest's announcement 30 minutes ago. About standing in the bedroom doorway like a stranger, backlit by weak winter sun, telling me he was leaving for the Maldives with the woman he truly loves. Those words. The woman I truly love. Not me. Not us. Someone else. Natalie, I said, and the name tasted bitter. His personal trainer. 26. Started working with her 6 months ago. He says she gets him. Makes him feel alive. All the things I apparently stopped doing. I tried to sit up when he first said it. The incision had screamed in protest and I'd collapsed back onto the pillows, tasting copper where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek. Natalie. I'd met her twice. Once at the gym when I'd picked Forrest up. She'd barely glanced at me, just kept talking to him about optimal heart rate zones. The second time at a charity fundraiser 3 months ago. She'd looked through me like I was furniture. Like I didn't exist. Now she was sitting in my Jeep heading to paradise with my husband. He didn't just tell me about the affair, I continued, my grip tightening on the satellite phone receiver. He told me he took the money. All of it. What money? Our joint savings. $42,000. 5 years of careful deposits, planning for a down payment on a house. He transferred it this morning while I was sleeping. While I was doped up on pain medication, 2 days post-surgery. Garrett swore low and vicious. He said it casually, Garrett. Like he was reporting the weather. Turns out Natalie and I don't need a house. We need a vacation. I closed my eyes, remembering the moment. Then he pulled out our apartment keys, the ones on the Tiffany keyring I gave him on our wedding day, and dropped them on the floor. The sound they'd made was so small. Just metal hitting wood. But it had echoed in my chest like something shattering. He changed the locks, I said. This morning. Same time as the transfer. My stuff is in a storage unit. Public storage on Route 38, Unit 519. He paid for 1 month. After that, they auction it off. That son of a... He thought of everything. Planned every detail. And he told me now, when I'm helpless. When I can barely stand. When I have no phone and no way to call for help if something goes wrong. The cruelty of it was what stayed with me. The precision. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in the heat of passion. This was calculated. He'd used my medical vulnerability as an opportunity. I remembered standing up just barely, pain tearing through me like wildfire. I'd pressed both hands against the incision, feeling heat, inflammation or rage, impossible to separate. Why? I'd whispered. Forrest had actually considered the question. Tilted his head like I was a mildly interesting puzzle. Because I want more. Because you're 39 and you let yourself go. Because Natalie makes me feel young. She's exciting. He gestured vaguely at me, lying there in my grandmother's old nightgown, surgical bandages visible through the thin fabric. You're not. He hadn't been yelling. Hadn't been angry. Just calm. Rational. Like he was explaining a business decision that made perfect sense. You'll survive, he'd said, adjusting his leather jacket, the one I'd bought him. You always do. That's your superpower, Brooke. You're a survivor. You adapt. You'll figure it out. He'd said it like an insult. Like my resilience made me disposable. Then he'd walked away. Just turned and left while I stood there, one hand pressed against a surgical wound, the other braced against the wall for support. I'd made it to the window. Every step had been agony, but I'd made it. Through frost-clouded glass, I'd watched him throw his suitcase into my Jeep. The Grand Cherokee I'd bought with inheritance money from Graham. The vehicle I'd specifically chosen for mountain driving, for visiting this cabin, for independence. Natalie had already been in the passenger seat. I could see her clearly. Young. Beautiful. Laughing at something on her phone with the careless ease of someone who'd never faced real consequences, never had to fight for anything, never learned that actions come with costs. Forrest had climbed into the driver's seat. Started the engine. Then, as if the cruelty hadn't been enough, he'd rolled down the window one last time. "Oh, Brooke," he'd called out, voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "Just making sure you heard me. You definitely can't get into the apartment. Wouldn't want you wasting energy trying when you finally make it back to civilization." He'd been grinning. Actually grinning as he said it. Then he'd laughed. A genuine, delighted laugh. Like abandoning his post-surgical wife in a remote mountain cabin was the funniest thing he'd done all year. I'd watched the Jeep navigate the narrow forest path. Watched it disappear around the bend where the pine trees grew thick. Watched the tire tracks slowly fill with fresh snow, erasing the evidence of his departure. "Brooke." Garrett's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you telling me he left you at the cabin? 2 days post-surgery? With no phone? No transportation?" "Yes. That's not just cruel. That's dangerous. You could have complications. You could..." He stopped, breathing hard. "That's criminal. That's abandonment. That's why I need you to make that call," I said. "Airport security. Report the credit card fraud. They're flying out tonight. 7 p.m. flight from JFK. Consider it done." I heard him moving, heard the sound of his laptop opening. "But Brooke, there's more to this. There has to be. You wouldn't just be calling me to delay their flight. What else?" I smiled despite the pain. My brother knew me too well. "I need you to do something else," I said. "Remember that investigator I hired 2 months ago?" Silence. Then, "The one you hired after Forrest told you that you were overreacting to his friendship with Natalie?" "That's the one. He found everything, Garrett. Hotel receipts. Text messages. Evidence that he's been draining our savings for months. Not just the 42,000. 60,000 total, moved into a private account I wasn't supposed to know about. Jesus. There's more. I found the Maldives reservation 3 weeks ago. Left open on his laptop. 2 tickets. 7 days. Aquatica Resort. Overwater bungalow. Booked under Forrest and Natalie Callahan." Garrett was quiet, waiting. "What Forrest doesn't know," I continued, "is that I called the resort the next day. Added a 3rd guest to the reservation." "You didn't." "I did. Told them my brother would be joining us. They were happy to accommodate. I sent you a separate confirmation. You never got it because I sent it to your old email address. The one you only check for spam and random stuff. But it's valid. Your name is on that reservation, Garrett. You have just as much right to that bungalow as they do." My brother laughed. A sharp, fierce sound that made me feel less alone. "You want me to crash their romantic vacation. I want you to deliver something. The investigator's file. Everything we have. Photos. Receipts. Text messages where Forrest called me the obstacle, and Natalie called me the old wife. Evidence of systematic financial abuse. I want them to understand exactly what they're losing." "I'm already packing," Garrett said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "My flight leaves in 4 hours. I'll beat them there by 12 hours. There's one more thing." "Hit me." I took a breath, savoring what came next. "I need you to tell airport security to check Forrest's passport. Tell them there might be a warrant." "Is there a warrant?" "There will be by the time you make the call. I've been working with a lawyer for the past month. Not a divorce lawyer, a criminal lawyer. Specializes in financial abuse cases. Garrett whistled low. You've been planning this. I hoped I was wrong, I said quietly. Hoped he'd prove me wrong. But I prepared anyway. What kind of warrant are we talking about? Emergency protective order. Asset freeze. And yes, an arrest warrant pending investigation of financial abuse and domestic violence. The law considers abandoning a post-surgical spouse without means of communication or access to funds to be life-threatening neglect. When does it hit the system? I checked the old clock on the kitchen wall. About 6 hours. Right when they'll be going through security. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Garrett's voice came through, rough with emotion. You're brilliant. You know that. I'm tired, I said honestly. But I'm not broken. No, he agreed. You're definitely not broken. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen, receiver still in my hand, feeling something settle in my chest. Not quite peace. Not yet. But something close. Forrest had called me a survivor like it was my weakness. He was about to learn it was my greatest strength. I hung up the satellite phone and stood there in the kitchen, my hand still resting on the receiver, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. The dial tone had gone silent, but my heart was still racing. Not from fear but from something sharper. Clarity. Purpose. The kitchen was cold. I'd let the wood stove burn down while I was on the phone with Garrett, too focused on laying out the plan to notice the temperature dropping. Now I felt it. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, makes your fingers ache, reminds you that survival requires attention to details. I moved to the stove, opened the iron door, and fed in 2 logs from the stack Forrest had so carefully prepared. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd stocked firewood thinking he was ensuring my survival just long enough to make his escape clean. What he'd actually done was give me the resources to stay comfortable while I dismantled his life piece by piece. The logs caught quickly, flames licking up around the dry bark. I watched them burn, feeling the heat start to radiate outward, and thought about timing. 6 hours until the warrant hit the system. Forrest and Natalie would be at JFK by now, probably checking in, maybe grabbing overpriced airport food and champagne, celebrating their brilliant escape. Forrest would be relaxed, confident, certain he'd planned everything perfectly. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the security checkpoint. I made my way back to the bedroom, each step still in negotiation with pain, and lowered myself carefully onto the bed. The incision pulled tight, a reminder that my body was still healing, still vulnerable in the ways the surgeon had warned about. But vulnerability wasn't weakness. I was learning that now. I reached for the drawer in the nightstand, Graham's old nightstand, the one she'd used for decades. Inside was her journal, the leather cover worn soft with age and handling. I'd found it 2 years ago while cleaning out the cabin after she passed, had read it cover to cover in one sitting, crying through most of it. Graham's marriage hadn't been what I'd thought. The stories I'd heard growing up, about my grandfather being a good man, a provider, a pillar of the community, were sanitized versions. The truth, written in Graham's careful handwriting, was darker. He'd been controlling, dismissive, unfaithful. He'd made her feel small, insignificant, like she existed only to serve his needs and maintain his image. She'd stayed for 30 years because that's what women did in her generation. You stayed. You endured. You smiled for the neighbors and pretended everything was fine. But after he died, she'd bought this cabin and built a different life. One on her own terms. I wasted decades trying to change him, she'd written in an entry from 15 years ago. I should have spent that time becoming who I was meant to be. There was another entry dated a year before she died. I'm leaving the cabin to Brooke. She has my spine even if she doesn't know it yet. She'll need it someday. I just hope she uses it sooner than I did. I closed the journal, feeling tears burn behind my eyes. She'd known. Somehow she'd seen it coming, not the specifics maybe but the shape of it. The pattern. My phone, Forrest's phone now, the one he'd stolen this morning, would have been buzzing with concerned messages by now if anyone knew where I was. But nobody did. I'd told my 2 closest friends I was taking time off to recover from surgery. Told them I needed quiet, needed space, would reach out when I was ready. Forrest had isolated me so carefully. So thoroughly. He'd probably thought that was another brilliant move. Make sure nobody would check on me for at least a week, maybe 2. What he hadn't counted on was Garrett. My brother and I had always been close, even after he moved across the country for work 3 years ago. We texted almost daily. Called once a week minimum. When I'd gone radio silent for 2 days, he'd known something was wrong. That's why he'd been calling. Why his voice had been sharp with alarm when he answered the satellite phone. Garrett had installed that phone after Graham died, during one of his visits to help me sort through her things. "You're up here alone sometimes," he'd said, mounting it on the kitchen wall. "What if there's an emergency? What if you get hurt?" I'd protested that it was overkill, that I had my cell phone, that I'd be fine. "Humor me," he'd insisted. "Besides, Graham would want it. She'd want to know you could always call for help." Forrest had been with me on that trip. He'd stood in the corner of the kitchen, arms crossed, watching Garrett work with barely concealed irritation. "This place doesn't even have reliable electricity and you're installing a satellite phone?" he'd said, voice dripping with disdain. "That's a waste of money." Garrett had looked at him, really looked at him, and something had passed between them. Some kind of masculine challenge I hadn't fully understood at the time. "Brooke's safety isn't a waste of money," Garrett had said quietly. "And if you can't see that, maybe you should reevaluate your priorities." Forrest had left the cabin shortly after, claimed he had work calls to make, spent the rest of the weekend in the car or on the porch, refusing to engage. I'd chalked it up to typical brother-in-law tension. Men being territorial. Nothing to worry about. Now I understood what Garrett had seen. What he'd recognized in Forrest even then. The capacity for abandonment. For cruelty. For calculating exactly how much he could take before someone fought back. I forced myself to stand again, moved to the small window that looked out over the side yard. Snow was falling more heavily now, thick flakes that would make the roads treacherous by evening. Nobody would be driving up here tonight. I was truly isolated. But isolation wasn't the same as helplessness. I thought about the investigator's file, about everything she'd uncovered over the past 2 months. I'd hired her after a therapy session that had gone sideways. Forrest and I had been trying couples counseling. My idea, not his. He'd agreed with a condescending sigh, like he was humoring a child. 3 sessions in, I'd mentioned his friendship with Natalie. How it made me uncomfortable. How the late-night training sessions and the constant texting seemed excessive. The therapist had asked Forrest to reflect on whether his behavior might be contributing to my anxiety. Forrest had laughed. Actually laughed. "Brooke's always been insecure. She sees threats where there aren't any. I'm just trying to stay healthy. If she can't handle me having a female friend, that's her issue to work through." The therapist had nodded thoughtfully, made some notes, and I'd felt my stomach drop. He was buying it. Buying his version of reality, where I was the problem, I was the insecure wife, I was the one who needed to change. After that session, I'd stopped talking about Natalie in therapy. But I'd started talking to a private investigator instead. Her name was Margaret Reeves. Former NYPD detective, specialized in surveillance and infidelity cases. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with a no-nonsense demeanor that made me trust her immediately. "I'm not here to tell you what to think," she'd said during our first meeting. "I'm here to find facts. What you do with those facts is up to you." The facts had been damning. 14 hotel visits over the past 5 months. Always the peninsula, always charged to our joint credit card. Text messages that made my skin crawl. Forrest calling me the obstacle, Natalie calling me the old wife. Both of them discussing how to handle the Brooke problem once they could finally be together. But the most damning evidence was financial. Margaret had access to tools I didn't, ways of tracking money that I'd never known existed. She'd found the private account Forrest had opened 6 months ago. Found the systematic transfers. 500 here, 1,000 there, sometimes more. Over $60,000 total, moved out of our joint savings into an account only he controlled. "This isn't just an affair," Margaret had said, sliding the report across the table to me. "This is financial abuse. Deliberate. Planned. If you wanted to press charges, you'd have grounds." I'd taken the report home, hidden it in a place Forrest would never look. Inside a box of tampons in the bathroom cabinet. Men never looked there. And I'd started planning. Not for revenge. Not yet. Just for protection. For leverage. For whatever came next. I'd contacted Julia Brennan, a lawyer who specialized in financial crimes. Explained the situation. Asked what my options were. She'd been blunt. "If he's systematically draining your assets while you're married, that's theft. If he abandons you in a vulnerable state without access to funds or communication, that could be domestic violence. But we'd need to prove intent. Intent. That had been the missing piece. Until this morning when Forrest had handed it to me wrapped in a bow. He'd waited until I was post-surgical. Waited until I was isolated at the cabin. Taken my phone. Taken my money. Taken my transportation. Left me with just enough supplies to survive but not enough to escape easily. That wasn't abandonment. That was attempted destruction. And it gave Julia everything she needed to file for an emergency protective order and an arrest warrant. The paperwork had been ready for weeks, just waiting for the right moment. This morning, while Forrest was busy transferring the last of our savings and packing his bags for paradise, I'd been emailing Julia from my laptop. The one he didn't know I had hidden in the cabin, the one I used for freelance work, the one with its own mobile hotspot for internet access. She'd filed at 9 a.m. Judge had signed by noon. Warrant would hit the system by 6 p.m. Right when Forrest would be going through airport security, boarding pass in hand, Natalie by his side, convinced he'd gotten away with everything. I moved away from the window back to the bed, lowering myself carefully onto the mattress. The pain was constant now, a low burn that the medication could only partially touch. But pain was just information. Just my body telling me what it needed. And right now what I needed was rest. Real rest. Not the fitful half-sleep of survival mode, but actual recovery. Because this wasn't over. The arrest was just the beginning. I closed my eyes, pulled Graham's quilt up over my shoulders, and let myself feel something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness. Not yet. But something close. The cold satisfaction of knowing that the man who'd tried to destroy me was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. You don't underestimate a survivor. You don't confuse endurance with submission. And you definitely don't forget about the satellite phone. Sleep didn't come. I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl through the pines, feeling the cabin creak and settle around me like a living thing. The pain medication had worn off hours ago, and the incision throbbed with each heartbeat, a metronome keeping time with my racing thoughts. I'd moved back to the armchair by the wood stove around 7, unable to stay still in bed, unable to do anything but wait. The fire threw dancing shadows across the walls, shapes that looked almost like people moving in the periphery of my vision. Ghosts maybe. Or just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. The clock on the mantel, one of Graham's antiques that still kept perfect time, showed 8:47 p.m. Forrest and Natalie would be at the airport by now. Probably through check-in. Maybe browsing the duty-free shops, picking out overpriced perfume or designer sunglasses for their tropical escape. Maybe sitting in an airport lounge, champagne in hand, toasting their brilliant plan. I wondered if Forrest was thinking about me at all. If any part of him felt guilt or hesitation. If he'd looked back as he drove away even once. Probably not. The man who could abandon his wife 2 days post-surgery wasn't the kind of man who suffered from conscience. I fed another log into the stove, watching sparks spiral up the chimney like tiny desperate stars. My hands were shaking, not from cold but from something deeper. Adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Anticipation that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The waiting was its own kind of torture. I forced myself to move to the kitchen to heat soup on the propane stove. Chicken noodle from a can, the kind Graham always kept stocked because it was cheap and lasted forever. I ate standing up, mechanical bites that tasted like nothing, but my body needed fuel. The surgeon had been clear about that. Nutrition was crucial for healing. As I ate, my mind kept drifting back over the past 6 months, playing them like a film reel I couldn't stop. The signs had been there. I just refused to see them. Forrest working late more often, coming home after I was already asleep, smelling like unfamiliar soap. His sudden obsession with fitness. Not just going to the gym but hiring a personal trainer, meal prepping, talking constantly about optimizing his body and investing in his health. I'd thought it was a midlife crisis. He was 37, maybe feeling the years creeping up, trying to recapture youth. I'd actually encouraged it. Told him I was proud of him for taking care of himself. God, I'd been so blind. Then there were the phone habits. The way he'd angle the screen away when notifications came in. The way he'd step into another room to take calls. The way he'd started keeping his phone face down on surfaces, like the mere sight of incoming messages was classified information. When I'd asked about it, casually, not accusatory, he'd made me feel crazy. You're being paranoid. he'd said, shaking his head like I was a child having an irrational tantrum. I'm allowed to have privacy. We don't have to share everything. And the touching had stopped. Not all at once but gradually. Like someone turning down a dimmer switch over months. The casual kisses goodbye became perfunctory pecks. The hand-holding stopped. Intimacy became scheduled, obligatory, something he endured rather than initiated. I'd suggested date nights. Couples therapy. A weekend getaway. Forrest had looked at me like I was proposing we climb Everest naked. We don't need therapy. We're fine. You're just overthinking everything like you always do. That phrase. Like you always do. Like my instincts were character flaws. Like noticing problems was the problem. I tried to believe him. Tried to convince myself that this was normal, that all marriages went through phases, that I just needed to be more patient, more understanding, less demanding, less emotional, less present. But something in my gut kept screaming that I was watching my marriage die in slow motion. That's when I'd set up the cloud backup sync on our phones. Told Forrest it was for convenience, for sharing photos, for making sure we didn't lose important information. He'd barely paid attention, just nodded and went back to his phone. He'd handed me the surveillance tool without even realizing it. For months I didn't use it. Didn't look. Told myself that if I trusted him, if I just gave him space, things would get better. Then came the therapy session. The one where he'd laughed when I mentioned Natalie. The one where he'd made me sound unhinged in front of a professional whose job was to evaluate our marriage. That night I'd opened the cloud backup. Started reading. The messages between Forrest and Natalie went back 8 months. Hundreds of texts. Photos I had to close immediately because seeing them felt like being flayed alive. Plans. Promises. An entire relationship happening in the margins of mine. She's getting suspicious, Forrest had texted one night in April. Just keep her calm until we can make a clean break, Natalie had replied. After the house closes, we'll have enough for the Maldives trip. Then I'll tell her. But they hadn't waited for the house to close. They'd found another opportunity. My emergency surgery. Perfect timing. Forrest had texted Natalie from the hospital waiting room while I was in the operating theater. She'll be out of commission for weeks. We can leave while she's at the cabin. By the time she figures out what's happening, we'll be gone. I'd read that message 3 times before my brain could process what I was seeing. He'd seen my medical crisis as an opportunity. That's when I'd stopped feeling guilty about spying. That's when I'd called Margaret, the investigator. That's when I'd started building a case instead of just collecting evidence of my own heartbreak. The clock showed 9:03 p.m. Any minute now. Any minute, Garrett would call and I'd know if everything I'd set in motion had worked. Or if Forrest and Natalie were boarding a plane to paradise while I sat alone in a freezing cabin, abandoned and betrayed and helpless. No, not helpless. I'd never been helpless. I'd been prepared. There was a difference. The satellite phone rang at 9:17 p.m. I moved faster than I should have, pain lancing through my abdomen, but I didn't care. I grabbed the receiver on the 3rd ring, nearly dropping it. Garrett. They pulled him aside. His voice was tight with barely controlled excitement. Both of them. Airport security. About an hour ago. I sank against the wall, legs suddenly unable to support my weight. Tell me everything. Homeland Security flagged them at the security checkpoint. Fraud alert on the credit card, the one they were using for the tickets. They got escorted to a private screening room. Forrest tried to talk his way out of it, apparently. Played the outraged innocent citizen card. Natalie just looked scared. And the warrant? Hit the system 23 minutes ago. I have a contact in TSA, called in a favor to get real-time updates. Brooke, they're reviewing it right now. Homeland Security doesn't mess around with this stuff. Domestic abusers trying to flee the country with stolen funds? They take it seriously. My hand was pressed against the incision, feeling my pulse hammer beneath surgical tape and healing tissue. Are they going to arrest him? Yes. Garrett's voice was certain. They're going to arrest him. Both of them probably. He's looking at financial abuse, domestic violence through abandonment, possibly elder abuse depending on how the prosecutor wants to frame it. I'm not elderly. The absurdity of the statement made me almost laugh. No, but you're a vulnerable adult. Post-surgical, isolated, denied access to funds and communication. The law doesn't look kindly on that. He paused. Brooke, they're not getting on that plane. Their Maldives vacation is over before it started. I closed my eyes, feeling something crack open in my chest. Not quite relief. Something more complex. He called me a survivor like it was an insult, I said quietly. He was right about one thing: you are a survivor. He was just wrong about what that means. He thought it meant I'd accept anything, endure anything, that I'd just adapt. Instead, you fought back. Garrett's voice carried something like pride. You didn't just survive, Brooke. You won. I stood there in the kitchen, satellite phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of the past 6 months. The suspicion, the investigation, the preparation finally pay off. Forrest had confused my endurance with weakness. Had mistaken my patience for submission. Had assumed that because I'd stayed, because I'd tried, because I'd loved him, that I would accept anything he chose to do. He'd been wrong. And now he was learning exactly how wrong. What happens next? I asked. They'll process him. Arraignment within 24 hours. He'll probably make bail, but with travel restrictions. Passport gets flagged. And Brooke? The asset freeze is already in effect. Every account with his name on it is locked pending investigation. Including the private account. The one with $60,000 he'd thought was his escape fund. Thank you, I said, and the words felt inadequate for what Garrett had done. What he'd helped me do. That's what family does, he said simply. Now get some rest. Real rest. You're safe. He can't hurt you anymore. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, just breathing. The cabin was silent except for wind and fire. I was alone. But I wasn't abandoned. I was free. I stood in the kitchen after Garrett's call, the satellite phone still warm in my hand, and felt the adrenaline that had been holding me upright suddenly drain away. My legs went weak. I caught myself against the counter, breathing hard, feeling the incision pull tight across my abdomen. Free. He'd said I was free. But freedom felt like collapsing, not flying. I made my way back to the bedroom, each step slower than the last, and lowered myself onto the bed with a careful precision that had become automatic. The mattress creaked beneath me. Graham's old mattress, the one she'd slept on for 30 years. The one that had probably witnessed her own long nights of reckoning after my grandfather died. I pulled the quilt up to my chin, but I couldn't get warm. Couldn't get comfortable. Couldn't stop my mind from spinning. The clock on the nightstand showed 10:34 p.m. Sleep didn't come. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the water-stained ceiling, counting the same imperfections I'd counted that morning. 7 irregularities in the plaster. 3 that looked like countries on a map. 1 that looked like a bird in flight. The wind picked up outside, howling through the pines with a sound like something alive and angry. The cabin creaked and settled, wood expanding and contracting in the cold, making sounds that were probably normal but felt ominous in the dark. Every creak was Forrest coming back. Every gust of wind was the Jeep returning up the mountain road. My rational mind knew he was in custody at JFK, that he couldn't hurt me, that I was safe. But my body didn't believe it. My body was still in survival mode, hypervigilant, waiting for the next attack. Around midnight, I noticed I was shivering. Not from cold exactly, the blankets were piled thick, but from something internal. I pressed my hand to my forehead and felt heat radiating from my skin. Fever. The surgeon's warnings echoed in my head. Watch for fever. It's one of the first signs of infection. Anything over 100.4, you need immediate medical attention. I didn't have a thermometer. Didn't have any way to know if this was 99 degrees or 103. Just knew I was hot and cold at the same time, shaking under blankets that felt both too heavy and insufficient. I should be in a hospital. Should have someone monitoring my vitals, checking the surgical site, making sure my body was healing instead of turning against itself. But I was alone in a cabin 200 miles from the nearest emergency room, because Forrest had decided abandoning me here was convenient for his escape plan. The rage came back then, hot and sharp, cutting through the fever fog. You'll survive. You always do. He'd said it like my resilience was a character flaw. Like the fact that I could endure meant I deserved to suffer. Like being strong enough to survive gave him permission to destroy me. But resilience wasn't passive acceptance. Resilience was choosing to fight back when someone expected you to break. I'd fought back. And now he was the one in custody, the one facing consequences, the one whose perfect plan had crumbled at an airport security checkpoint. The thought warmed me more than the blankets did. I must have dozed eventually because the next thing I knew the clock showed 2:17 a.m. and I was soaked in sweat. The fever had spiked and broken, leaving me clammy and weak but more clear-headed. I forced myself out of bed, every movement deliberate and careful, and made my way to the bathroom. My reflection in the mirror was startling. Pale, hollow-eyed. Hair matted to my skull with sweat and 3 days of not washing it properly. I looked like someone recovering from serious illness. Which I supposed I was. I ran water in the sink. The cabin had a well, thank God, one of the improvements Graham had made in her later years, and washed my face, the back of my neck, my arms. The cold water felt like salvation. Then I peeled back the surgical dressing with shaking hands. The incision was angry red, the skin around it tight and inflamed. But it wasn't weeping. Wasn't showing the green or yellow discharge that would signal serious infection. Just healing the way surgical wounds heal. Ugly, painful, slow. I applied fresh antibiotic ointment from the supplies the hospital had sent me home with. The supplies Forrest had begrudgingly carried to the car, sighing the whole time like being helpful was an imposition. Covered it with a new dressing. Took 2 ibuprofen from the bottle on the counter. In the mirror my eyes met their reflection. Who was this woman looking back at me? She looked familiar but foreign. Like someone I used to know who'd been replaced by a harder version. Someone who'd been tested and had passed, but at a cost I couldn't quite calculate yet. I thought about Forrest and Natalie at the airport. Probably separated by now. Probably in different holding cells or interview rooms. Probably realizing slowly that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with Forrest's charm and confident explanations. Did Natalie know about the warrant yet? Did she understand that the man she'd been planning a romantic escape with was facing criminal charges? That she might be facing charges too as an accessory to financial fraud? I wondered if she was scared. He was crying. If she was starting to see Forrest for what he really was. Not the charming fitness enthusiast who made her feel special, but a man capable of abandoning his wife 2 days after emergency surgery. A small, petty part of me hoped she was terrified. A larger, more tired part just felt sad. Sad that this was what my marriage had become. Sad that the man I'd loved or thought I'd loved had turned into someone capable of this level of cruelty. I made my way back to the main room, too unsettled to return to bed. The armchair by the wood stove called to me and I sank into it with a grateful sigh. Fed 2 more logs into the stove, watched the flames catch and dance. This had been Graham's spot. I could picture her so clearly, sitting right here after my grandfather died, probably asking herself the same questions I was asking now. How did I not see it coming? Were there signs I missed? Was there a version of this where things turned out differently? She told me once during one of my teenage visits, being alone isn't the same as being abandoned. Alone is a choice. Abandoned is a violence. At the time I thought she was being melodramatic. Graham had a flair for the poetic, for statements that sounded profound but felt abstract. Now I understood with brutal clarity. Forrest hadn't just left me. He tried to erase me. Systematically. Carefully. He'd taken my money, changed the locks on our home, stolen my phone, isolated me in a location with no cell service, no easy transportation, no neighbors to check on me. He'd wanted me helpless. Wanted me broken. Wanted me to suffer while he started his new life with someone younger, fitter, uncomplicated by surgical scars and medical trauma. But he'd underestimated me. Had confused endurance with submission. Had assumed that because I'd stayed, because I'd tried, because I'd been patient with his distance and dismissive with his contempt, that I would accept anything. He'd been wrong. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a woman who'd inherited her grandmother's spine, who'd learned from her grandmother's mistakes, who'd understood that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is fight back. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind began to die down, and through the window, I could see the first hints of dawn turning the sky from black to deep blue to pale gray. I'd made it through the night. Through the fever. Through the waiting and the wondering. The satellite phone rang at 6:43 a.m., jarring in the pre-dawn quiet. I grabbed it on the second ring. Garrett. They arrested him. His voice was rough, gravelly with exhaustion. Both of them. About 2 hours ago. Forrest on the warrant. Financial abuse, domestic violence through abandonment. Natalie as an accessory to fraud. They're being held pending arraignment. The words should have felt like victory. Should have flooded me with relief or satisfaction or vindication. is that I felt empty. Hollowed out. Like I'd been fighting so hard for so long that now that the fight was over, I didn't know what to do with my hands. Brooke? You still there? Yeah. I'm here. Are you okay? I looked around the cabin, the wood stove glowing, the shadows retreating as dawn light filtered through the windows, Graham's quilt still on the bed, her journal on the nightstand. No, I said honestly. But I will be. Garrett was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him in his apartment across the country, phone pressed to his ear, worried about his little sister. I'm flying to you, he said finally. First flight I can get. I'll be there by tonight. You shouldn't be alone right now. I'm not alone, I told him, and I meant it. I had myself. The version of myself that Graham had raised. The version that knew how to split wood and read weather patterns and survive in isolation. The version that understood the difference between being alone and being abandoned. The version that knew how to fight back. I have myself, I said. And right now that's enough. After we hung up, I sat in the armchair watching the sun rise over the mountains, feeling the cabin warm as light filled the space. Forrest was in custody. The money was frozen. The apartment locks could be changed back. I'd won. So why did victory feel so much like grief? The question hung in the air long after I set down the satellite phone. Why did victory feel so much like grief? I sat in the armchair watching full daylight spread across the cabin, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeams, and tried to make sense of the hollow ache in my chest. Forrest was in custody. I'd won. So why did I feel like I'd lost something essential? The answer came slowly, unwelcome, because I had lost something. Not Forrest. I'd lost him months ago, maybe years. What I'd lost was the story I'd been telling myself about who we were, who I was, what my life meant. That story was gone now. Burned away like morning fog. And I didn't know yet what would replace it. Around noon I heard an engine on the mountain road. My body went rigid, fight or flight response kicking in before my brain could catch up. But it wasn't the Jeep. It was Garrett's truck. A beat-up Ford that he'd driven cross-country more times than I could count. He wasn't alone. A woman climbed out of the passenger side. Compact, fit, maybe 50, with the kind of capable energy that radiated competence. She was carrying a medical bag. Garrett helped me to the door. I hadn't realized how weak I'd gotten until I tried to stand, tried to walk, and felt my legs shake with the effort. "This is Susan," Garrett said, supporting my weight as I swayed. "She works search and rescue. Trained paramedic. I asked her to check on you." Susan didn't waste time with pleasantries. She guided me back to the armchair, set her bag down, and started pulling out equipment. Thermometer. Blood pressure cuff. Stethoscope. "How long have you had the fever?" she asked, pressing the thermometer against my forehead. "Since midnight. Broke around 2. Any chills? Nausea? Dizziness? All of the above." The thermometer beeped. She checked it, frowned. 99.2. That's elevated but not critical. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm, pumped it tight. "When was your surgery?" 4 days ago. Emergency hysterectomy." Her eyes met mine and I saw recognition there. Not just medical recognition. Something deeper. "And you've been here alone since when?" 2 days. She didn't say anything, just finished taking my blood pressure, checked the reading, made a note on her phone. Then she looked at Garrett. "She needs a hospital. The incision is healing, but she's at risk for complications. She needs 4 antibiotics and professional monitoring." "I'm fine," I started to say, but Susan cut me off with a look. "You're not fine. You're recovering from major abdominal surgery in a remote cabin with no medical support. You developed a fever. You're weak, dehydrated, and if that incision gets infected, you could go septic." She softened slightly. "I get it. You wanted to be alone. But alone and endangered are different things." I was too tired to argue. They bundled me into Garrett's truck. Susan in back with me, monitoring my vitals. Garrett driving with the careful focus of someone transporting something fragile. The 2-hour drive back to town felt longer. Every bump in the road sending jolts of pain through my abdomen. But I was grateful. Grateful I didn't have to be strong anymore. Grateful I could let someone else make decisions for a few hours. The hospital loomed ahead. All concrete and glass and fluorescent lighting. The same hospital where I'd had the surgery. The same emergency entrance where Forrest had dropped me off 4 days ago with barely concealed impatience. Susan stayed with me through triage, through the intake process, through the transfer to a room. Professional courtesy, maybe, or just human kindness. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The surgeon appeared within an hour. The same tall woman with gray-streaked hair who'd operated on me. Her expression when she saw me was complicated. Concern. Anger. Something that looked like recognition. "Where's your husband?" she asked, and the question was weighted. "Arrested," I said. "JFK Airport. Last night." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't look surprised. "Tell me." So I did. All of it. The abandonment. The stolen money. The changed locks. The deliberate isolation while I was recovering from surgery she'd performed. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I've seen this before. Men who view their wives' medical crises as opportunities rather than emergencies. I saw it in his face when I was explaining your recovery needs. I'm sorry I didn't say something then. You couldn't have known. I knew enough." She examined the incision with careful hands, checked my chart, made notes. "I'm admitting you for 3 days. For antibiotics. Close monitoring. You're healing, but you're borderline for infection. Another day or two alone in that cabin and we might be looking at sepsis. 3 days feels excessive. 3 days is necessary." Her tone left no room for argument. "Also, you'll meet with our social worker. Standard procedure for cases like this. Cases like this. Domestic violence. Abandonment. Medical neglect." I nodded, too exhausted to fight. Julia Brennan arrived the next morning with a briefcase and the focused energy of someone who'd slept 4 hours and considered it a luxury. She spread paperwork across the hospital bed tray like a general planning a campaign. "Asset freeze is in effect," she said without preamble. "Every account with Forrest's name. The joint savings, his private account, everything. He can't touch any of it pending the criminal investigation. And Forrest. Out on bail as of this morning. $50,000 which his parents posted. But he's got travel restrictions, can't leave the state, has to surrender his passport, has to check in with a monitoring officer twice a week." She smiled, sharp and satisfied. Natalie too, though her bail was lower. 20,000. Her parents weren't thrilled. His lawyer. Trying to claim the transfer was legal, that you're weaponizing the system out of spite, that this is a bitter spouse using the courts for revenge. Julia's smile widened. "Let him try. We have text messages where Forrest explicitly discusses timing your abandonment to your surgery. We have evidence of systematic financial abuse going back 6 months. We have medical testimony that his actions constituted life-threatening neglect. He's not winning this. I should have felt triumphant. Should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. Bone deep, soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting too long, from discovering that the person you trusted most was capable of cruelty you couldn't have imagined. But there was something else too. Something small and hard beneath the exhaustion. A kernel of satisfaction that I'd been right not to trust, right to prepare, right to build my case before he could destroy me completely. "There's one more thing," Julia said, and her tone shifted. Got more careful. "What?" "Natalie's lawyer contacted me yesterday. He wants to cooperate. Wants to testify against Forrest in exchange for reduced charges." I stared at her. "What?" Turns out the Maldives trip wasn't her idea. It was Forrest's. He convinced her he was already divorced, that you were unstable and vindictive, that the money was his to spend however he wanted. Julia pulled out her tablet, swiped through screens. When they got detained at the airport, when she realized he'd lied about everything, that you weren't divorced, that he'd stolen the money, that he'd abandoned you post-surgery, she tried to back out. Told the investigators she didn't know, that Forrest had manipulated her. And they believed her? Enough to offer a deal. She provides everything. Text messages, emails, recordings of conversations where Forrest planned the abandonment, timed it to your surgery, discussed how long you'd be trapped at the cabin before you could get help. Julia met my eyes. With her testimony, our case goes from strong to airtight. He's looking at serious prison time. I closed my eyes, feeling something complex twist in my chest. Not quite pity for Natalie. Not quite vindication. Something in between. What does she want in return? Reduced charges. Probation instead of jail time. A chance to walk away from this without a felony record. And you think we should take it? I think her testimony puts Forrest away for years instead of months. I think it shows premeditation, planning, malice. I think it turns this from marital dispute to calculated abuse. Julia's voice softened slightly. But it's your call. Your case. Your life. Garrett arrived that evening with something wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the hospital bed carefully like it was fragile. Found this at the cabin, he said. Thought you might want it. I unwrapped it. Graham's journal. I'd forgotten I'd left it on the nightstand, forgotten everything in the chaos of Garrett's arrival and Susan's examination and the drive to the hospital. Now I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, and started reading. Graham's handwriting was spidery, elegant, the penmanship of someone educated in an era when that mattered. The entries went back decades. I flipped to random pages, reading fragments. 1987. He came home at 2 a.m. again. Smelling like perfume that isn't mine. When I asked, he said I was paranoid. Made me feel crazy for noticing. 1992. I asked if we could go to counseling. He laughed. Said counseling is for weak people who can't handle their own problems. 1998. He's taken money from our account again. Won't tell me what it's for. Says it's none of my business what he does with his own money. But it's our money. Our account. Our life he's spending. The patterns were so familiar they made my chest ache. I flipped to the end, to entries from the year before Graham died. I wasted decades trying to change him. Should have spent that time becoming who I was meant to be. Should have left. Should have fought back. But I was scared. Scared of being alone. Scared of what people would say. Scared I couldn't survive without him. And then a few pages later, Brooke came to visit today. Brought that man she's going to marry. Forrest. I watched him all day. The way he talks over her. The way he dismisses her ideas. The way he checks his phone when she's speaking. I see it so clearly. The pattern. The beginning of what I lived through. I wanted to warn her. Wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her and say run. But she's in love. She wouldn't hear it. So instead I'm leaving her the cabin. She has my spine even if she doesn't know it yet. She'll need it someday. I just hope she uses it sooner than I did. I closed the journal, tears burning hot behind my eyes. She'd known. Graham had seen it from the beginning. Had recognized Forrest for what he was. And she'd left me the tools to survive him. The cabin, the lesson of her life, the spine she'd finally found too late to save herself. But not too late to save me. I held Graham's journal against my chest that night in the hospital, feeling the weight of her words settle into my bones like calcium-strengthening fractures. She'd known. She'd seen the pattern. She tried to warn me in the only way she could, by leaving me the tools to save myself. The next morning, Julia arrived with coffee and a manila folder thick with documents. Forrest's lawyer called, she said, setting the coffee on my hospital tray. They want to mediate. Settle before trial. When? 2 weeks. That gives you time to recover, time to get your strength back. She pulled a chair close to the bed. You don't have to do this. We can proceed to trial. But mediation gives you control. Gives you a chance to face him on your terms. I thought about it. Thought about sitting across the table from Forrest. Thought about looking him in the eyes while he tried to explain away what he'd done. I want to do it, I said. Julia smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of recovery and preparation. The antibiotics worked. The fever stayed gone. My body slowly remembered how to heal itself. Garrett stayed with me, sleeping on the pull-out couch in the hospital room the first few nights, then taking me back to his apartment once I was discharged. His place was small but comfortable. One bedroom that he insisted I take while he camped out in the living room. You're recovering from surgery, he said when I protested. I'm sleeping on a couch. It's not a debate. Julia came by every few days with updates. Forrest was staying with his parents in their house upstate. Natalie had moved back to her studio apartment, wasn't talking to anyone, had apparently quit her job at the gym. The criminal case was moving forward. Trial date set for 3 months out. Unless we settle in mediation, Julia reminded me. Which is what Forrest wants. He doesn't want this going to trial. Doesn't want it becoming public record. Good, I said. Let him be scared. The courthouse was downtown, all granite columns and marble floors and the kind of institutional coldness that made you feel small. Julia met me on the steps, briefcase in hand, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, even though ready felt like the wrong word. I was here. That would have to be enough. The mediation room was small. Conference table, 6 chairs, windows overlooking a parking lot. Forrest was already seated when we entered, his lawyer beside him. He looked different. Thinner. His expensive haircut had grown out, losing its shape, making him look younger and somehow diminished. He was wearing a button-down shirt I didn't recognize, khakis that were wrinkled like he'd slept in them. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His lawyer stood, extended a hand to Julia. "Michael Patterson. Thank you for agreeing to this." Julia shook his hand with professional courtesy. "Julia Brennan." We sat. The mediator, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and steel-gray hair, introduced herself and explained the process. Voluntary. Confidential. The goal was resolution both parties could live with. Michael spoke first, sliding a document across the table. "We're prepared to offer a settlement. Mr. Callahan will return the $42,000 in full. He agrees to the divorce with a 50-50 split of remaining marital assets. He'll vacate the apartment within 30 days, allowing Ms. Hawthorne to resume residence." Julia picked up the document, scanned it, showed it to me. No admission of wrongdoing. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just money and logistics, like our marriage was a business deal gone bad. I looked at Julia. She looked at me, letting me decide. I leaned forward, finally meeting Forrest's eyes. "No." His gaze skittered away, then came back, uncertain. "No," I repeated. "You don't get to buy your way out of this with money and clean paperwork. You don't get to walk away pretending you did nothing wrong." Michael started to speak, but I kept going, eyes locked on Forrest now. "You called me a survivor like it was an insult. Like my ability to endure made me disposable. Like being strong enough to keep going gave you permission to destroy me." My voice was steady. "Come. Nothing like the trembling mess I'd been 2 weeks ago. But you were wrong. I didn't just survive what you did. I planned for it. I saw it coming. And I made sure you'd face consequences." Forrest's face flushed red. "You're vindictive," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "You're punishing me because I fell in love with someone else. Because I wanted more. Because you—" "I'm punishing you," I interrupted, my voice cutting clean through his excuses. "Because you abandoned me 2 days after emergency surgery. Because you stole money from our joint account. Because you took my phone, changed the locks, and left me isolated in a cabin with no way to call for help if I hemorrhaged or got infected or needed emergency care. This isn't about love, Forrest. This is about you being a coward." The room went silent. Even Michael looked uncomfortable. "You called yourself smart," I continued. "Said you were smart enough to take the opportunity. But you weren't smart. You were cruel. There's a difference." "I gave you 9 years," Forrest said, and now there was desperation in his voice. 9 years of my life. You got boring, Brooke. You got old. You stopped trying. I wanted more. I deserved more. Then you should have divorced me," I said. "Like an adult. Like a decent human being. You should have said, 'This isn't working, I want out,' and we could have separated like rational people. Instead you stole from me. You lied to me. You used my medical crisis as cover for abandonment. You left me to suffer because it was convenient for your escape plan." I leaned back, feeling Julia's presence beside me like reinforcement. "There's no version of this where you're the victim." Forrest opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. Julia slid a document across the table. "Our counteroffer. Full return of all stolen funds. The $42,000 plus the additional $18,000 we can prove was transferred prior to the Maldives trip. Plus damages for emotional distress and medical complications resulting from abandonment. Mr. Callahan agrees to testify truthfully in the criminal proceedings. He signs an affidavit admitting to financial abuse and domestic violence through abandonment. He pays all of Ms. Hawthorne's legal fees. And he vacates the apartment within 7 days, not 30. Michael picked up the document, scanned it, his expression darkening with each paragraph. "This is excessive. You're asking him to admit to crimes he hasn't been convicted of." "He committed those crimes," Julia said simply. "We have evidence. We have testimony from his accomplice. We have his own text messages planning the abandonment. The criminal trial will prove everything in that affidavit. We're just asking him to be honest about what he did." This is vindictive, Michael said. This is justice, Julia corrected. Take it or go to trial. Your choice. Michael looked at Forrest. Forrest looked at the document, then at me, then at the table. Can we have a moment? Michael asked. The mediator nodded. They stepped out into the hallway, leaving Julia and me alone in the conference room. You did good, Julia said quietly. You didn't let him make you small. My hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline. Fury. Something that felt like grief and vindication tangled together. When they returned, Forrest's expression was defeated. Hollow. I'll sign, he said. Michael produced the documents. One by one, Forrest signed. Each signature an admission, each page a piece of justice I'd fought for, prepared for, survived for. When it was done, he looked at me one last time. I didn't mean for it to go this way, he said, and he almost sounded sincere. Almost. You meant for me to suffer, I said quietly. You just didn't mean for me to fight back. He flinched like I'd slapped him. Sid walked to the door without another word, Michael trailing behind him with the signed documents. The door closed. Julia started gathering paperwork, sliding copies into her briefcase with efficient movements. How do you feel? She asked. I sat there in the conference room looking at the empty chair where Forrest had been, trying to identify what I felt. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Not even satisfied. Empty. Hollowed out. But also free. Empty, I said honestly. But also free. Julia nodded like she understood. That's normal. You spent months fighting. Now the fight's over and you don't know what to do with your hands. What comes next? He pays. You move back into the apartment. The divorce finalizes in about 6 weeks. The criminal case proceeds. Though with his signed affidavit, he'll probably take a plea deal. Probation, maybe some community service, permanent record. And then you rebuild. She smiled. You're 39. You have your whole life ahead of you. You get to decide what it looks like now. Outside the courthouse, Garrett was waiting on the steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking worried until he saw my face. How'd it go? He asked. I handed him the signed settlement agreement. He read it, eyebrows rising with each paragraph, then let out a low whistle. You got everything, he said. Not everything, I corrected. I didn't get an apology. Didn't get him to admit he was wrong, that he regretted it, that he understood what he'd done to me. You got him to admit what he did, Garrett pointed out. That's more than most people get. We walked to his car. He drove me back to his apartment in comfortable silence, letting me process, letting me sit with whatever I was feeling. My phone buzzed halfway there. Text from an unknown number. I opened it. I'm sorry. I didn't know. No signature. But I knew who it was from. Natalie. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something complicated twist in my chest. Anger. Pity. Exhaustion. Then I deleted it. Some apologies come too late. Some bridges burn too thoroughly to rebuild. And some people don't deserve the energy it would take to forgive them. I put my phone away and watched the city pass by the window, feeling lighter than I had in months. I'd faced him. I'd told him the truth. And I'd walked away. That was enough. The phrase echoed in my head for weeks after the mediation. In Garrett's apartment, sleeping in his bedroom while he camped on the couch. In physical therapy sessions where I relearned how to move without favoring the surgical site. In the quiet moments before sleep when my mind would replay the confrontation, Forrest's face, the signatures on the settlement documents. That was enough. But was it? The divorce finalized 6 weeks later. I wasn't required to attend. Just signatures, paperwork, legal dissolution of 9 years reduced to a judge's stamp and a court filing number. Julia called me with the news. It's done, she said. You're officially single. I'd expected to feel something, relief, sadness, liberation. Dad, I just felt tired. The money came back in increments. The $42,000 first, then the additional $18,000 from the earlier transfers, then the damages Julia had fought for. By the time everything cleared, there was nearly $70,000 in my account. More than I'd had before Forrest started draining it. I stared at the balance on my phone, feeling disconnected from the number. It was just money. It didn't undo what had happened. Didn't erase the betrayal or the fear or the nights I'd spent alone in that cabin wondering if I'd survive. But it gave me options. And options felt like freedom. The criminal case ended with a plea deal just like Julia predicted. Forrest pleaded guilty to financial abuse and domestic violence through abandonment. 2 years probation. Community service. Permanent restraining order. And a criminal record that would follow him forever. He'll never work in finance again, Julia told me. Background checks will flag the conviction. He's done. I should have felt satisfied. Should have felt vindicated. Mostly I felt empty. 3 months after the mediation I went back to the cabin. Not to hide. Not to escape. But because I needed to see it again. Needed to stand in the place where Forrest had tried to break me and prove to myself that I'd survived. Garrett drove me up, insisted on staying the first few days, made sure I could handle being there alone. The cabin looked exactly the same. Wood stove. Graham's furniture. The water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of nowhere. But I was different. I walked through the rooms touching surfaces, remembering. The kitchen where I'd called Garrett on the satellite phone. The bedroom where I'd watched Forrest drive away. The window where I'd stood and smiled because I knew something he didn't. You okay? Garrett asked, watching me with concern. Yeah, I said and meant it. I'm okay. I used some of the settlement money to renovate. New windows that actually sealed properly. Updated kitchen with a real stove and a refrigerator that didn't sound like it was dying. A generator that worked reliably, not just when it felt like it. The cabin transformed from primitive to comfortable. Still rustic. Still remote. But livable year-round if I wanted. And I wanted. 6 months after Forrest's arrest, I moved back to the cabin full-time. Garrett thought I was crazy. You're isolating yourself, he said. You're running away. I'm choosing where I want to be, I corrected. There's a difference. I set up the porch the way Graham used to have it. 2 chairs, a small table, a view of the forest that changed with the seasons. In early autumn, I sat there in the evenings drinking tea, watching the leaves turn from green to gold to crimson, watching the light change as days grew shorter. I thought about Graham a lot. About her journals. About the decades she'd wasted trying to change a man who didn't want to change. About how she'd finally found herself after he was gone. I should have spent that time becoming who I was meant to be. I was doing that now. Becoming. Not running away but running toward something. Toward myself. Garrett visited every few weeks, his truck rumbling up the mountain road with groceries and news from the outside world. He told me Forrest had moved. Texas apparently. Working some low-level job in retail. Living with roommates. The criminal record had destroyed his career prospects. Good, I said and meant it. He also told me about Natalie. She'd moved to California trying to start over. She'd sent a longer apology letter through Julia. Pages explaining how Forrest had manipulated her, lied to her, made her believe I was unstable and vindictive. I'd read it once. Then filed it away in a drawer I rarely opened. I didn't forgive her. But I understood. Understood how easy it is to believe someone when they're charming and confident and telling you exactly what you want to hear. Are you lonely up here? Garrett asked one evening, the two of us sitting on the porch watching the sun set. No, I said. I'm alone. But not lonely. There's a difference. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He seemed lighter. Like something heavy finally let go. He was right. Something had let go. The weight of trying to save a marriage that was already dead. The weight of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. The weight of being someone I thought I should be instead of who I actually was. I'd started painting. Something I'd loved in college, something I'd given up when Forrest had said it was impractical, that it wouldn't pay the bills, that I should focus on my graphic design work instead. Art is a hobby, not a career, he'd said with that dismissive certainty he had about everything. Now I painted because I wanted to. Not well, I was rusty and maybe I'd never been that good to begin with. But it didn't matter. The act of creating something, of watching colors blend on canvas, of making something beautiful out of nothing, that was enough. I also started volunteering. 2 days a week, I drove into town and spent the afternoon at a women's shelter, helping women who were trying to escape situations like mine. Sometimes worse than mine. I listened to their stories. Helped them fill out restraining orders and police reports and applications for emergency housing. Told them they weren't crazy, they weren't overreacting, they were surviving. One woman, Sarah, mid-30s with a black eye she tried to cover with makeup, asked me how I'd found the strength to fight back. I told her about the satellite phone. About the evidence I'd collected. About preparation and instinct. But mostly I told her this: you're already strong. You're already fighting. Now you just have to believe you deserve to win. She cried. I held her hand. And I thought about the surgeon who'd looked at Forrest with recognition. The woman at the shelter coordinator who'd recognized my story the first day I volunteered. The nurse who'd examined me at the cabin and known immediately what had happened. We recognize each other, women who've survived. We know the signs. And we help each other escape. The anniversary came quietly. 1 year since the day Forrest had stood in the cabin doorway and announced he was leaving for the Maldives with the woman he truly loved. 1 year since he'd driven away laughing while I stood at the window, post-surgical and abandoned, planning his destruction. I marked it by hiking up to the ridge behind the cabin. It was a steep climb and my body still remembered the surgery. Certain movements pulled oddly, scar tissue protesting. But I made it. At the top the view stretched for miles. Mountains and forest and sky, endless and indifferent and beautiful. I thought about Forrest one last time. Wondered if he regretted it. Wondered if he understood what he'd lost. Not just the money or the career, but the chance to be someone better than he was. Probably not. Men like him rarely do. They move on, find new targets, repeat patterns until someone finally stops them. But I'd stopped him. At least for me. At least for now. I wasn't his victim. I never had been. I'd been his wife, then his opponent, then the woman who beat him. Now I was just Brooke. Myself. Whole. I breathed in the cold mountain air, autumn turning toward winter, the smell of pine and approaching snow, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way I'd imagined happiness when I was younger, when I thought love and marriage and partnership were the path to fulfillment. But peace. The kind that comes from surviving something that tried to destroy you. The kind that comes from knowing who you are when everything else is stripped away. The kind that comes from choosing yourself. I stood on that ridge for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Then I turned and hiked back down to the cabin. To the wood stove I'd learned to tend. To the paintings drying on the porch. To the life I was building on my own terms. Forrest had called me a survivor like it was an insult. He was right. I was a survivor. But survival wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. I survived. And now I was learning how to live. If this story of calculated justice kept you hooked until the very end, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Brooke smiled at the window, knowing about the satellite phone Forrest had completely forgotten. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more gripping stories of revenge and resilience. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.